Okay, welcome to the review for the final exam. Hey, you made it this far. You must be serious, huh? Okay, just like before, we're going to go through some of the rules. Please download this final topics list, kind of follow along so you'll be able to see exactly what's going to appear on the test. So just like before, this is going to be the last half of the book, chapters 7 through 12, so it's not comprehensive, not going back to the first half of the book. There's 50 questions in the pool, but you're only going to get 40 questions in the test. Which questions you're going to get and what order they're going to be in is completely up to the computer. I don't get involved in that. Once again, I show you the chapter and page number to provide context for the question. That does not mean that the question came from that page, nor does it mean that the answer is going to be found on that page. Okay. I hope you remembered all that from last time. So, a little bit about the test. About half or so are the short answer, where I'm asking you to describe something. There will be some why kind of questions. I highly recommend, if you see a why question, is read the question, maybe read it a second time, fill in your answer, and then read the question a third time to see if you're answering the correct question. A lot of people have trouble with my why questions. Okay, so sorry, about half are these normal short answer things. There's like one or two true false, one fill in the blank, a couple of multiple choice, and the balance, so there's multiple answers, like which of the following are true. But same kind of a scenario as last time. Perhaps a few more answers. I'm sorry, a few more questions that are not in the book as compared to the midterm, and perhaps a few more of the short answer as compared to the midterm. So let's kind of go through it and wish you guys luck. Okay, the first one's about software as a service. I'm probably going to ask you a scenario-based question. Something like, give me an example of, or explain why this is appropriate, or something like that. A scenario-based question talking about software as a service. Again, I'm never going to ask you to define what software as a service means, although clearly if you know the definition of the term, you'd be better off, but I'm not going to ask you to recite the definition. The next one talks about Windows Form versus web development. And what are the differences? This may be one of those which of the following are true kind of things. On listing, what's appropriate for web design, what's appropriate for form-based design. Just boom, 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 boom. The next one's talk about Web 2.0 and how that's kind of an overhyped term. So I may ask you, again, I'm not going to ask you to define it necessarily. I'm going to ask you to describe or compare to something. Compared to what exists prior to that kind of stuff. The next one talks about when you're making a decision between in-house and purchased software, perhaps a scenario where one would make more sense than another. I may give you a specific guidance and say, describe a scenario where you should always go in-house, or describe a scenario where you should always go with purchased. The next one's on total cost of ownership, and the TCO, and just basically how the costs typically roll out. On a normal circumstance, a TCO calculation will show that this cost occurs here, that kind of stuff. The next one's about the software acquisition process. Remember, there's an entire step-by-step thing. I'll probably do one of those where I say, in which one of the steps would this occur, or where would you find this in that list? The next one's about the system requirement document. I've stressed this on multiple occasions, on multiple videos over multiple chapters, about why this is an important document. I'll probably give you a scenario using the system requirements document, and then ask you whether or not that scenario makes it more important, less important, insignificant, something. The next one talks about the so-called golden rule for doing user interface design. I talked about this in video, not too much in the book. It's actually in the book. 100% of the ideas associated with the golden rule are actually in the book. It's never accurately, concisely spelled out and put together exactly the same way I did it in lecture. So yes, I talked about a specific golden rule, something that you should keep in mind when you're developing user input kind of things. The next one talks about the transparent interface, how IBM coined this phrase called a transparent interface. I'll ask you, something about that. The next one talks about how and why certain things appear where they do and don't, to make things easier to learn. I'll probably give you a scenario base saying, why is it that I should do X, Y, and Z? And with regard to making the user interface easy to learn. And you're going to have to figure out what scenario or why that's the case. Why do I have to do that? The next one talks about help and feedback, and we talked about the feedback could be error messages, for example, and how some error messages should be tell you that A, you made a mistake, and then B, how to fix it. If you do one or the other, or without doing both, you're probably not doing it right. The next one talks about layout, and I talked in lecture a bit about when you're doing a layout, you're supposed to have a very efficient design and all the rest of that. I also mentioned a technique when doing layout that you should consider if you expect an opportunity to come in and make some changes later on. The next one talks about the radio buttons versus checkboxes. Most of you guys are familiar with these terms, but there's some pretty decent descriptions there in the book. And yes, there are specific scenarios where one is more appropriate than another. And I'm going to ask you a scenario-based question on how exactly when one would be more appropriate over another. The next one talks about validation rules. There was an entire list of validation rules, a whole bunch of them. And I'm going to ask you a scenario-based thing saying something along the lines of which one of these rules is applicable for this example. And I'll give you an example, and it'll be like a fill-in-the-blank thing where you write the answer. Come on, you know what I'm talking about. Where you put the answer on which one of those rules applies. The next one is that source data automation. That really was in the book, but it wasn't emphasized quite the way I did it in lecture. And again, kind of a scenario-based question on when you should use source data automation, what's it for, maybe even a combination of the two, where I'll ask you, give me an example and explain why it's important. Okay. The next one talks about output security. I gave you a scenario from my personal experience on how I solved a problem of having the security of the output compromised. If you can remember that scenario, you remember that story from lecture, you'll be in good shape. The next one talks about file-based databases. They still exist, and I gave you some discussion about where these are commonly found. In some cases, they're file-based, just long enough for you to take in the data and perhaps put it in another format. Perhaps it's only temporary. It's file-based to begin with, and then you turn right around and you put it in a true relational database system with tables and all. But I gave you a scenario, and you don't necessarily have to use my exact scenario that I used in lecture, but you do have to come up with some sort of a scenario where that's still appropriate. The next one talks about relational databases, and there's a lot of advantages for doing relational databases, right? I mean, all sorts of things. And so I'm going to go through those advantages, and I'm going to say which one of those advantages is an example of this scenario. So I'm going to give you a scenario and say, okay, this is either a problem or this scenario is a solution. Now, which one of the DBMS categories, so to speak, attributes, whatever the term would be, it describes that the best. The next one talks about the schema. I mentioned in the lecture that there's another use for a schema over and above just being able to describe the database. And so I'm going to ask you a question specifically about that. The next one talks about web databases. And we have a database on a web server. And so I'm sitting here on a client machine and with a browser, and I'm hitting this thing. What is it I have to make that work? That would be a good question. The next one talks about middleware. And middleware industry is probably in decline because there's an awful lot of things going on, and it used to be the systems were very, very disparate, and you had different coding and styles. You had ASCII over here and Unicode over here and EBCDIC over here, and you had to have something to translate with them. So middleware was big business, but not quite so much now. So I'm probably going to ask you something related to that, and it won't be just describe why middleware is no longer appropriate. It'll be more than that. It may be a two-part question. Describe this and what else is going on. The next one is those database terms. On that page 356, they talk about a whole list of terms, and I'm going to ask you something about those terms. What does something kind of sort of mean? This is probably the closest you'll ever get to a definition-based question. But when you see it, it really won't be definition-based. I just can't bring myself to do that. Okay, the next one is on foreign keys. Remember, primary keys, foreign keys. I'm going to ask you something specific about a foreign key. Next one is referential integrity. I gave some scenarios about how it's very, very useful when you're in a production environment and I'm trying to insert a record, but I'm missing a piece someplace else, so it won't allow me to insert it. And I also described a scenario where sometimes I really wish with referential integrity it would temporarily go away. So I may ask you a question on it turned on. I may ask you a question about a scenario when it's turned off. Okay. The next one talks about data normalization. Now, this is not going to be a technical discussion about, what does third normal form mean? That's not what this is going to be about. I'm going to ask you a generalization question about comparing something that's in second normal form to third normal form. That's it. Not going to get into the weeds about, relates to the key, the whole key, and nothing but the key, so help me God. None of that. Okay. Data mining. I gave some scenarios on how data mining can be very, very useful, particularly if you just turn it unconstrained and just let it roam through the data and find its own patterns that you never even thought to look for. I also gave an example of turning it loose and ending up with total gibberish at the end. So I'm probably going to ask you a scenario-based question, either one about how you can use it successfully and obtain good data, or I might ask you one about how you can use it successfully to return absolute garbage. The next one talks about architectural choices and how sometimes the choices are not really technical. There could be some other reasons why you want to make one choice versus another. And so I'm going to ask you probably a scenario-based question on how that might occur. Thin versus fat client. We talked a bit about how a thin client without a hard drive is less likely to be stolen, for example, because if they got it home, they wouldn't be able to do anything with it. They plug it into the wall, and all it would try to do is find its boot P server and not boot up at all. So a lot of people in a public environment use thin clients just for security. So I'm going to compare some thin client versus fat client, and probably ask you a very simple one versus the other kind of a question. Okay, we're coming up on the 15-minute mark, so I'm just going to pause this for just a second, and then we'll come back and finish this thing off.